Well, thanks for doing this. It's a pleasure meeting you finally.
My pleasure.
Let's start with your early life. If I've read correctly, that you spent a lot of your early life in Latin America. Is that right?
I did. I did. I grew up in Argentina and in Honduras and graduated high school in Brazil. So had the opportunity to be in Buenos Aires at a very young age with my family. About 5 years old initially. So then had the opportunity, of course, to speak Spanish and Portuguese, and go to the American schools in those places. My father was a career intelligence officer.
I read in one spot that you actually thought about following his example. Is that right?
I did. It's sort of a funny story because until I was 16 years old, I thought I was following in the example of someone who was employed by the State Department. And only when I was 16 did I learn that the reason my father was never going to be ambassador is he didn't work for the State Department. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. So that, of course, shows that he was pretty good at keeping his secrets, even from a 16-year-old, firstborn. So I had thought that I would, because I so much enjoyed growing up in Latin America, that I would enjoy being in a similar situation. As it turned out, my father was really the wise man in the discussion and suggested that I at least competed against an international career in the private sector, which led to my being employed by Texaco. And from that point forward, I never looked back.
I heard also that you were interested in the airlines as a young man, though.
No, not really.
Oh,
No, as a young man, so what actually happened is as I became curious about the private sector, one of the wonderful things that happens when you grow up in places such as Rio or Buenos Aires is you have the opportunity to meet the people who are responsible for the big American companies that are doing business in those places. And in this instance, I played softball, summer softball. The school had a team that played in the off-season against the teams that were formed by the embassy, by the U.S. Marines, by General Electric, by, ironically, Texaco, and in one instance, in Pan Am. So I became very friendly with the fellow that was the Latin American president for Pan American. And I wrote him for advice when I was thinking about maybe I would be interested in the private sector. And he wrote me a letter that has amused many people since the United experience and said, Glenn, I have no doubt that whatever you choose to do, you'll do well. So I think I encourage you to look into the possibilities of the private sector as well as the public sector. But I'd like you to promise me one thing. Whatever you do, please never ever work for an airline. So that's the way that actually happened. I was not encouraged. I wasn't interested and he wasn't encouraging.
Okay. I understand you took a degree in international relations?
International studies, which include
Sure.
the economic side as well as the political side.
Is that part of your experience growing up, that this was something that interested
Oh,
you?
for sure. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, if you imagine the curriculum while I was growing up, half the day was in the native language. American schools, you'd have half day of study in English and half day of study in Portuguese. And it internationalizes you. So as much as I enjoyed that, I simply concluded, and remember, I thought I was going to be a Foreign Service officer. So the discipline made perfect sense.
How did living abroad like that and having that sort of unique experience as an American inform the way you looked at the world and continue to?
Well, it's hugely impactful. It's enormously impactful. The schools are referred to as the American school, but in fact, they're really the international school, and they are schools that are attended by the sons and daughters of international business people and the diplomatic corps, and not just the diplomatic corps from North America. So immediately from Buenos Aires forward, you're in an environment where you are constructively exposed to multiculturalism, to nationalism, to global perspective at a very, very early age. It is actually a transitional challenge to come back to the United States and have it be so relatively homogenous. So I think it's very seductive to want to continue to do that, to be in a global environment.
How did you end up working in the industry business? Excuse me, the energy business.
So when I was considering the two paths, public sector, State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, other agencies of the U.S. government, and the private sector, the one thing I knew was I wanted to work, if I was going to work in the private sector, I wanted to work in an environment where that company had global operations. And that really limits the scope. I mean, GE, the big companies such as Bechtel and Fluor, construction companies, and then of course the energy companies are among the most global. So I narrowed it down to those on the East Coast that were headquartered there at the time. Texaco, Esso, Mobil, Amoco, of course, was here in Chicago. And I discovered that Texaco was investing heavily in the Middle Atlantic states in infrastructure, terminals, depots, pipelines, service stations, and the like. So I interviewed in Washington, D.C., which is very convenient because that's where I was at the time. And as they say, the rest is history.
You held a number of positions at Texaco, working your way basically all the way up. And you were there with the merger with Chevron?
I was.
In that experience, what qualities, as you grow as a business leader, what are the qualities that you look for, that you begin to develop, that make you successful in this world?
I think the most important thing in almost any endeavor is the early appreciation that your success is going to be the product of the work of others. You are not going to be in that environment a sole practitioner. And it's a lesson that I think is best learned really early. So your success is going to be the sum of your team's success. Even when I didn't have any subordinates per se, I had a geographic area that was assigned to me that was populated by independent business people who were leasing service stations, for example, from Texaco. For me to be successful, they had to be successful. And I wanted them to be successful. So once you learn, I think, quickly that your success is going to be the sum of others, I think that you understand that's very different from being say, a dentist or a doctor, or professional, or even a carpenter, for example.
You could have stayed in the energy business and retired from it. How did you come to be at United Airlines? They were looking for someone to help, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, actually, in a manner of speaking, I did. I mean, I having become chief executive officer, chairman of Texaco, I then consummated the merger between Texaco and Chevron with my counterpart in Chevron. They were the acquiring company, in contrast to ourselves and Continental at United. So we had moved out to San Francisco, and I was a 54-year-old vice chairman rather than the chairman. And the fellow, matter of fact, here in Chicago, that was retained by the United board, and I had worked together before at Texaco. Matter of fact, on director searches and senior officer searches. So they had gone through an 11-month process. They were unsuccessful in 11 months. They concluded, a search committee led by Jim O'Connor here in Chicago, came to the conclusion that they needed to look outside the industry box, especially since what was inevitable at United was the need for a dramatic financial restructuring of the company rather than simply stewardship of a company that was in good shape, because the company was not in good shape. So they traveled out to, after an initial visit with the search firm, and I was also the chairman of Dynegy, an energy company that had become collateralized by the collapse of Enron and really the collapse of that entire business model. So I was commuting between Houston as chairman of Dynegy and San Francisco, and spending a lot of time as a Caltex board member in the Far East. And I had no time. And when they asked if I would come to Chicago, I had to decline. And they asked what I would do, and I said, well, if you'll come to San Francisco, I'd be happy to sit and to talk to you. And about 6 of them, I guess, flew out on a Sunday morning to the Westin Hotel in San Francisco. And the way that they positioned it was, this is an American iconic brand and an iconic company that should not go the way of Pan American and Eastern and Braniff, and eventually TWA. And our city needs it to succeed. These were quintessential Chicagoans that led this effort. And they said, Chicago, we want to modernize O'Hare. As O'Hare goes, Chicago goes. But O'Hare isn't going to be able to do what O'Hare needs to do to modernize itself if we don't have United. So it was presented to me in a context that was actually greater than the business itself, the business of an airline. It was clear to me that the successful turnaround of the company was important to the city, was important to the region, and was really, in a sense, important to the industry. If they just continued to cascade into liquidation, it was a terrible price to pay for an undisciplined business that couldn't right itself.
What was the key to turning United around?
Focusing on the facts rather than as they were, rather than the facts as we wish they might be. The single most important thing.
Mm-hmm. And how was it accomplished? This was a long period of time.
We had a very, very valuable suite of assets around which to reorganize. And we could make the proposition to the creditors and the bondholders and all of the other stakeholders, including the unions, who were very, very disappointed in the state of affairs, that at the end, if we did this successfully, witness today, the value of the company would grow. Their compensation for their participation in the restructuring would be a stake in the future company. So, Lester, you had to agree that the future of the company was sufficiently promising that you would invest in it emotionally and financially and put the future of your career on the line, that it would be better than selling off the assets of the company. Because the alternative is what happened to the other carriers. And the reason that United has such a strong presence in Asia is because we bought the Pan American routes when they went into liquidation. So it wasn't as if there wasn't a Chapter 7 alternative. There truly was, and they're very valuable assets. You can either reorganize around those assets or you can sell those assets.
I'm going to go back to something you said a little earlier about why you were approached about this and why this group of people wanted us to succeed. How important was this to the city of Chicago and the area around it in continuing as a global business and commerce center?
I think it was pivotal. A liquidated United, just imagine the consequences of a liquidated United, would mean that O'Hare, as the Midwest hub, would be disintegrated. Because there'd be a piece of United with Delta, there'd be a piece of United with American, maybe there'd be a piece of United with Northwest, and you wouldn't have your anchor tenant that you really truly needed to have out here in O'Hare. So as Mayor Daley immediately recognized, as you go, we go, and we need you to successfully reorganize United, and I, of course, needed them to modernize O'Hare. so that our investment in United would be symbiotic with the modernization of O'Hare.
And the new runway comes into play.
Right.
That's a
Right.
big part of it.
Right. Right.
Well, how does the merger with Continental tie into all this?
So there were three things, back to your question about what did I think had to be done. So the first thing that had to be done is United needed to get its house in order. And United needed to focus on the facts that it was bankrupt for all practical purposes. After all of the angst and the pain and the tragedy of 9/11, the company was bankrupt. And we tried to avail ourselves of the ATSB loan guarantee, but with hindsight being as perfect as it is, even the ATSB loan guarantee, which was order of magnitude something like $1.6 billion, would have been insufficient for us to do what we needed to do to restructure the balance sheet of the company. The company had less than $1 billion in cash. Days of operating cash in the event that we had another event such as 9/11. So we had to move from the traumatic experience of 9/11 and the fact that the industry had been put into a tailspin as a result of that, to understand that if we were going to go forward, the company was going to have a strong balance sheet, and the company was going to have to be financeable, and the company was going to have to attract investment, and its equity was going to have to be perceived as something worth owning. So that was our own book of work. We had to do that. The second thing we had to do is reorganize the company so that we had operational integrity, so that our performance was competitive. Our on time had to be dramatically improved, our customer experience had to be dramatically improved, our fleet had to be improved, our capital investment had to be enabled. We had to be able to invest in everything that passengers wanted us to invest in. And that's become even more material now. Those things included things such as protecting the value of Mileage Plus, all those miles that people had accumulated. And so all of those things had to be done. The next thing that had to be done is there had to be fewer of us. There were simply too many airlines fighting for too few customers and too many hubs that really weren't hubs. With no disrespect to Cleveland or no disrespect to Pittsburgh or no disrespect to Memphis, they were being sustained as expensive hubs, but they really weren't hubs. So the upshot of that is the industry needed to consolidate. And then after the industry consolidated, which of course it has, down to 3 networks, United, American, Delta, now you can grow around those businesses. And you can grow globally too. So we knew that doing any 2 of these but not the third would not be sufficient to actually get it to a situation where you could, with any confidence, tell a family member, you might want to invest in a United or a Delta or an American, which today, of course, look at the performance of the shares, has come to pass. Many things have been said about the extraordinary risk of investing in airlines. You go back to, I guess it was, there was one famous investor who said that if he'd been a Kitty Hawk when the Wright brothers took off, he'd have shot them down. A lot of money's been lost in this business.
Yeah, I think the phrase I always hear is, well, how do you make $1 million in aviation? Well, you start with 5 or 10.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Sometimes the same thing is true.
They're all equally eloquent, right? Right. No,
yeah.
That's true. But
Yeah.
look, I think the number is something on the order of 165 bankruptcies since deregulation. Can you imagine that?
How did this, I've seen several of your presentations on video as someone who is very strongly bullish on Chicago and, very interested in the continued success of this city. How did your relationship with this transformation of United make you so bound up in the future of the city?
It's a great question. So there were notable Chicagoans on the board. 2 that come to mind in the very beginning: Jim Farrell, the chairman and chief executive officer of ITW, and of course Jim O'Connor. The passion that they had for their city, mirrored then by the passion Mayor Daley had for his city. And the success that I had when I traveled with either one of them or with the mayor out to visit very, very worried corporate customers around the city, Motorola, Abbott, Aon, McDonald's, and I said, with one or two of them sitting by my side, you stick with us on this, and we're going to get through it. But if you don't, we won't. We can't have you abandon ship now when we are most fragile. We need you and your salespeople and your global travelers, your business people, to stay with us. And this city rallied behind this restructuring. I mean, I felt at times, as I spoke publicly, that I actually had the support, of Chicago for the restructuring. And I don't know that happens in many other cities that I could think of. I've often said that because of my experience in the energy industry, the only city that comes close, and it's close but different, is Houston, in its embrace and its support for the energy business. But if you think about the difference, this particular city, for a long while, hasn't had one industry that defines it. It embraces, the diversity of its industries, which is different from finance in New York, energy in Houston, or for that matter, tech in San Francisco. So it's dramatically different in that regard. But this is a hugely supportive community of a challenge, of meeting a challenge. So if you saw much of what I was saying early days then, and to some I think it seemed outrageous, the executive club or the economic club, that what we were going to do, not only were we going to right this ship, we were actually going to constructively participate in the consolidation of the industry, and this was going to be one of the companies that was going to be a survivor company. We were not going to be acquired. We were going to be acquired. We were going to be an acquirer rather. It was a bold thing for the city to believe.
Well, not only survive but thrive.
Right. No, absolutely.
Which is what you've done.
No, we actually got to the point where we could actually lay out the terms. The name of the company is going to be United. The company's going to be headquartered in Chicago. The jobs are going to stay in Chicago. We're going to be committed to O'Hare. Mm-hmm. So, you're in essence, you're making good on a commitment, but at the same time, you're also repaying a debt. I mean, you're also stepping back and saying, you supported us in our hour of need, and we're happy to do the same.
How did you pivot from United and then moving over to the banking area?
Well, as Jamie said when I talked to Jamie Dimon about the opportunity, which had been Bill Daley's, which was interesting in its own context, but he said, "Look, you've been a good, knowledgeable client for a long, long time, and that's exactly what we need. Is we need the lens of the client applied to our business in the Midwest, rather than really only the lens of those who've been on the banking side." And I think it actually was a very good idea. I think it actually worked out quite well.
Well, I've also read that while you were here, you made sure that people with the bank moved into areas of civic engagement, into philanthropy, into really tangible ways of making Chicago an even better city to live in.
We did indeed, and they did it very enthusiastically. I mean, they were very keen. So the members of the Midwest Operating Committee that convene here, of which there are 18, all passionate Midwesterners and all keen to participate in these various boards. So we sat early, and I said, I want each one of you to tell me where it is that you want to serve. Where do you want to serve? What are you passionate about beyond your discipline within the bank? And it was not difficult at all for us to place those people on these civic boards and have them contribute mightily, because they're very, very capable people. Mm-hmm. And they bring truly valuable skills to those philanthropic and cultural boards that they really dearly need.
Well, when you talk to someone like Jim Farrell or John Canning, they'll get back to you and say, this investing in the quality of life in Chicago is good business for us, and it makes it an even greater community, a greater place to live. If we're thriving, the city should thrive, and the institutions that make it a wonderful place to live should thrive. And I've been impressed by talking to people like yourself over the years that it's kind of a small town in a way. You can pick up the phone and call 5 or 10 people, and pretty soon you've got a movement going here.
No, it is a small town. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be the chairman of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm going to succeed Lester Crown, iconic Chicagoan of enormous stature, difficult shoes to attempt to fill. I'm also the co-chair of the Plan for Economic Growth and Jobs at World Business Chicago. I had meetings with both yesterday. All of those endeavors where you have John Canning and I are on the Northwestern Memorial Healthcare Board together. You see all of those colleagues in all of those common endeavors, all of them working on the same thing. Jim O'Connor and I worked together on Big Shoulders. We had the mayor's welcoming breakfast for the new Archbishop this morning. Everybody in that room qualifies to be defined as you described a moment ago. They are all committed and dedicated to the success of Chicago, a small town, because it allows them to do that. It reaches out and encourages them to do that. I dare say I don't think that New York City does that. It's just difficult for New York City to do that as Chicago does. Something quintessentially Midwest about it.
Yeah, there's something about that unique Chicago identity. People are proud of it. They'll fight for it. They'll move heaven and earth for it. And that's always been one of the fun things about working on this project. I get some insights into that. Who's passionate about the lyric opera or the symphony or the Art Institute or the Field or the Museum of Science and Industry.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, what's next? You seem like it's still very, very busy, very actively involved. What are the things on your plate now?
So I'm on the Abbott board. I'm on the AbbVie board. I'm on the Phillips 66 board. I'm on the Northwestern Memorial Healthcare board. I'm going to chair the Council on Global Affairs with its new CEO, Ivo Daalder, who came to us from NATO, having been the U.S. ambassador to NATO, discovered Chicago as you describe it when he was here for the NATO summit, and said, if opportunity ever existed here, I'd be delighted to take advantage of it. I was on the search committee that convinced Ivo to come to Chicago, so I suppose I have an obligation to work with him on the transformation of the council. I'll continue to work on the plan for economic growth and job creation here in the city and co-chair it with Michael Sachs. So there's really not a lot of spare time. I mean, I'm as fully engaged as I've ever been.
Looking back on, as you say, there's still plenty of work to be done. But looking back on your career, what to date has given you the most personal satisfaction over what you've been able to accomplish?
I don't think that I think of it as a particular event. I think that the way I think about it is regardless of the stature of the position, what I think I remember over some 40 years is I enjoyed each one of them as much as I enjoyed the next. So when I look back fondly, it wasn't the biggest job, right? And I took some jobs along the way that I think conventional wisdom would have suggested that might not be the path to the corner office. That might not be the path to become CEO. But I did it because I thought it would really be interesting. I remember making a decision in Texaco to go into strategic planning and the head office in New York. And I was a division manager. And I had a tremendous amount of conventional wisdom that said, gee, if you go into a staff job, sometimes you never really return from a staff job. You don't have a P&L, you don't have a track record. little difficult to keep score in strategic planning. I mean, how do they keep score there? But I said, I'm only going to get this opportunity once, and I really do want to see a larger piece of the company. And from strategic planning, you can see the whole company. So I guess what I would say is the risks that I have taken, from the little ones such as that to a pretty big one, leaving what was certain to be a pretty enjoyable rest of my energy career at 54 as vice chairman of Chevron Texaco, to come to Chicago and have the United experience. I think it's been the risks, small risks, big risks. Each one of them been a tremendous learning experience. So I tell you, I have extracted from the experience a robust, life's experience. I put it that way.
The other thing that comes through is you seem to have just such a genuine sense of affection for this city and the people here.
Oh, I tell you, it's unavoidable. I mean, the city reaches out and embraces you and lets you do whatever it is that you have the energy and the capacity and the skill and the will to do. And then it thanks you in a very big way. I mean, one thing to think about here, this is a very grateful city. I mean, when you do what it is that you can for this city, it takes note of that. I mean, it's a very appreciative city.
Sure is. And getting to that bit over there, what did you think when you were told, when you found out that you were going to be nominated for the Lincoln Award?
I was stunned. I was really surprised. And the reason I think that was my first thought is, my first thought was, well, I'm not a native son. I mean, I am new to Illinois, relatively, although we've now been here longer than I've been anywhere in my life, which is a statement in its own context, right? But I thought, gee, I'm not sure that that's perfectly appropriate. So I gently pushed back on it, on the logic of it a little bit. I was saying, man, it's got to be somebody that is a native son that is more deserving of this, because you know how dear it is and how tiny the list is. But when we had the conversation that you and I just had about you adopted us and we adopted you, I came around to the logic of it. But I'm overwhelmed by it, especially given its namesake.
Well, no doubt about it.
Yeah, no doubt.
As Michael Beschlaw says, it's kind of a state religion here.
Yeah, well, and it should be a state religion everywhere. Yeah. Actually, we ought to let it go.
Is there anything else I didn't touch upon, Glenn? I think we're in pretty good shape.
Can't imagine. Oh,
okay,
great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Well done.
Same here.
Thank you. Thanks.